Okay, so we are continuing with the developing country characteristics. So in the third, we discussed the inequality and poverty issues earlier in the lecture. So here you see a figure that shows the population living under $1.25 per day in millions. As you see, uh, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, uh, the shares are somewhat stable, slightly increasing in sub-Saharan Africa after 90s. Um, there is much faster decrease in East Asia and Pacific, okay, since 80s. This is partly due to, of course, Chinese rise, okay, and the rest of the developing world is is kind of stable. The total population share living in absolute poverty. Okay, and of course you would see a different figure, similar but still quantitatively different figure if you change the cutoff level. Instead of $1.25, you can look at $2, $1, etc. And you can, of course, also look at this figure country by country. So actually, one of the nice things you can do this week is to go to website of World Development Indicators in World Bank. So you can see many different indicators, and you can actually explore, country level differences in several dimensions as well. So if you are interested in such measurements, just go to World Development Indicators website, and you can actually download and study some of these figures. In the fourth part, we said developing countries or underdeveloped countries have higher population growth rates. In this figure, so this is one of my working papers with my co-author Serdar Sayan. This is total fertility rate in some of the selected countries that we focus on in that paper. So that paper is about international trade and dynamic Hacettepe models, or Ricardian plus Hacettepe frameworks. So what you see here is that in the horizontal axis you see years. This is actually 5-year intervals, and on the vertical axis you see births per woman. So this is total fertility rate, total period fertility rate, to be more specific. And you see here different countries: Italy, Japan, France, and USA. So these are here, okay. So in 1950s, they already have relatively lower fertility levels, but other countries, including India, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, and Brazil, so they have much higher fertility in 1950s, around, between 5.5 and 7 kids. Okay, in these countries, 2.5 to 3.5 kids, okay, per woman. Now in time, of course, in these developed countries, fertility rates keep decreasing. In developing countries, they are decreasing as well, but there is a difference, right, between the fertility levels of these two different sets of countries. So developing countries have much higher fertility rates, and in some of the developing countries or underdeveloped countries, we also see higher mortality rates as well. So that type of difference matters a lot, and in the upcoming weeks, when I discuss education and population, I will return back to such demographic issues. Here is a list of countries. So this is again from your text. In many different countries in recent decades, we see ethnic and religious conflicts. these countries include Afghanistan, Rwanda, Mozambique, Guatemala, Mexico, Sri Lanka, Iraq, India, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Angola, Myanmar, Sudan, the former Yugoslavia, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So these are just, so there are other cases as well, but these are the most notorious ones. Um, so it is important in that respect to have um, an optimal degree of ethnic and social or religious fractionalization. So there is some exciting research about the effects of genetic diversity on development outcomes. You can check the work of Oded Galor and Kumrul Ashraf. I can send you the links if you are interested. So they develop a methodology, an econometric methodology, to discover what is the optimal level. Because if you have too little genetic diversity, that also affects your creativity. So you do not become a very much innovative country. If it is too much genetic diversity, then there is ethnic conflict, and then that creates a downward pressure on your efficiency levels, aggregate efficiency levels. So possibly, they argue, there is an optimal level of uh, ethno-linguistic or social fractionalization in the economy. Um, Here we have larger rural populations, but rapid rural to urban migration. In this table, you see the share of urban population in regions, in world regions. Um, Around the world, about half of the population is living in urban areas. But if you look at more developed countries, that average is about 75. If you look at, for instance, South Central Asia, it is around 30%. So there is much variation in that regard as well. East Asia is closer to the world average. Western Asia is better in that regard as well. But for instance, Northern Africa, Morocco, Libya, Algeria, Egypt, uh, they're again much lower. And of course, in Sub-Saharan Africa, the urban share is also low. Um, Industrialization, here again, I block quoted a short passage from your textbook as well. Basically, um, today's developed economies are in the meantime industrial economies. So we call them industrial, and there is a good reason behind that, because their growth takeoff originated by the transfer of resource from agriculture to industry. So they developed new technologies. They were innovative, and the factory system and the machines and all this stuff. So they become industrialized, and after some point, some of the resources also transfer to services. So their industrialization process is much more um, growth promoting and technology based than what we saw, what we record for developing countries. So as the text says here, industrialization is associated with high productivity and incomes, and has been a hallmark of modernization and national economic power. It is no accident that most developing country governments have made industrialization a high national priority. Yes, so but then again, today there is what Daniel Rodrik calls premature industrialization. Premature deindustrialization, right? So in many countries across the world, now the share of industry is also decreasing, and services share is increasing, but that happened too soon. That happened too soon. Soon relative to what? Relative to the optimal degree of industrialization and economy. Because typically, industrialization uh, makes a country technologically developed in time. If you look at Britain, if you look at Germany, if you look at US, all these countries industrialized, and their industrialization was mature enough at some point so that the economy becomes a technology-based, innovative economy. Then there is a slight decrease in the share of industry and an increase in the share of services. In many developing countries and undeveloped economies, Now industrialization reaches a point, but that point is not high enough, or the income levels are not big enough to create a mature deindustrialization. So in most of the developing countries today, we observe premature deindustrialization, and that includes, unfortunately, Turkey. One other thing that we discussed was adverse geography. So here, being landlocked matters a lot, actually, because then you do not have access to costs and trade routes, and you do not have uh, you face transportation problems, for especially for international trade. Then there's extreme heat versus milder weathers. So if you are closer to the equatorial line, then if you are in tropics, then on average, life is much more difficult there in many regards, and this includes, of course, disease environment as well. Okay, infectious diseases are much more common in tropical areas. Now, rainfall, terrain, and elevation also matter, because these simply determine the type of agriculture you can do and the type of crops you can grow. Um, there is also a natural resources problem. So you need, of course, some sort of natural resource to develop your economy, and that also becomes an issue of macroeconomic and balance of payment stability, right? So that is important. But in the meantime, if you have a large reserve of natural resources, capturing the rents associated with these natural resources becomes an important institutional problem, because then there's corruption, then there is, um, struggle for uh, extract these resources and isolate the rest of the society. So elites versus the masses problem enters the picture here, and there is, of course, the international dimension as well. All right. So there's something called the curse of natural resources. So we also discuss in the upcoming weeks some of these elements. And also, one last question is, you should think about whether geography is really a destiny or not, because there are some countries that remain in tropical zones, but they're high income. There are some countries in difficult environments, but they have, they exhibit some fast growth. So those are also interesting. Um, for underdeveloped financial and other markets, there are a couple of issues that I listed here, again, directly from your text. One is law enforcement and property rights. Of course, the institutional setup of markets matter a lot. A stable and trustworthy currency is important, and as you know, currently in Turkey there's much volatility in Turkish lira. Infrastructure matters for physical access. Um, Banking regulations matter, as we all know, since the global financial crisis. Extreme deregulation creates many harms, and the world suffered from this a lot. Um, Market information systems are also important, because you need to deliver the info at the right time to the right people so that their welfare improves. All right, so prices, quantities, and quality of products, all of these things, and here, as you see, credit worthiness of potential borrowers. So those are the things that, in general, matter for the healthy operation of markets, in a capitalist private ownership economy. Finally, social norms are, of course, also important. Uh, Lastly, for this part, we have the effects of colonial legacy and external dependence. I want to emphasize a couple of things here. One is that, and which is studied in the literature a lot, institutions are persisting in time. So, in other words, institutions change slowly. All right, and in the colonial history, in most of the economic and political histories of today's developing or underdeveloped countries, we see colonial experiences. So Western colonial powers basically invade the country, take control of economic and political matters, and then one thing they did, especially if the purpose was extraction of resources, one thing they did is that they established poor, poorly designed institutions just for extractive purposes. So those institutions helped the colonial powers to, more easily extract the resources from that particular country. But then, since institutions persist, the role of such extractive institutions are still affecting the countries today. Okay, that's one interesting channel to look at. Another is inequality, because inequality itself is affected, and and affecting the development outcomes. So institutions, especially if they are extractive and not inclusive, they create an economic and political environment that supports higher inequalities. So that create wealth inequalities, consumption inequalities, income inequalities. So there's usually an elite in that country that is cooperating with the colonial powers. And then there's the rest, the masses, the agriculture, mostly the poor rural agricultural workers. So that type of inequality also matters a lot in the future, because since institutions persist, institutions that promote higher inequalities also persist. For this reason, for instance, land reform that decrease land inequality in poor rural countries create important development impacts. Another thing is external dependence. Again, historical ties with the colonial powers or former um, imperialists now create low bargaining power for many underdeveloped or developing economies, especially when it comes to international political and economic relationships. Trade ties are important, and most of the time, we understand that because of specialization patterns, external dependence creates some delaying effects on industrialization. The famous case is with UK and India. Uh, India was a former British colony, and they had trade relationships with Britain in the 19th century as well. And those specialization patterns favored investments into more people and specialization into more labor-intensive technologies, labor-intensive goods in India. So Britain was transforming itself into a capital-intensive economy, specializing more in capital-intensive goods and increasing capital per worker, so becoming more capital abundant. India remained a labor-abundant country that specializes more in labor-intensive goods. So that there is also that delaying effect. So I want to stop here because I have like 8 to 7 more slides about other things that I introduced earlier, but that can wait until next week. And we have now 2 minutes, less than 2 actually. So if you have questions or comments, I will respond to them. Otherwise, I think we can continue next week with our third lecture, and I will start right from here, where I stop now. So the floor is yours if you have anything to share, or if you have any question or clarification requirement. Is everybody still with me? Well, attendance is not bad today, so good. Okay, less than 1 minute. So if you do not have any input, I will close this session and I will see you next week. Oh, by the way, where is Senem? Is Senem
Buradayım
here?
hocam.
All right, Senem, just prepare your short lecture on Sri Lanka for next week. We will have sufficient time next week to discuss to conclude comparative development. Okay.
Okay.
All right then. I see you are not providing any input. I will close this session and see you next week then. You can
İyi günler hocam.
direct questions or comments to my email. Bye bye.